Are you looking for an elegant and chic dress with beautiful drape? Then look no further. My name is Iben, and in this video I'll show you how I sew my dress, Tidsel. This dress is super feminine and suits many different women. The dress is cut on the bias, which means the fabric skims the body without feeling tight. On the front, the neckline is finished with a plungy cowl neckline, and you can choose to finish the dress as either sleeveless or add one of two different sleeves depending on the look you're going for. The dress is fully lined and sewn with French seams for a luxurious and hard-wearing finish. You can buy the dress pattern on the website beklædt.com. Alright, let's get started. For the dress I'm using this satin woven jacquard silk, which I bought from none other than Mood in New York. The fabric is incredibly fluid, has a gorgeous drape and natural stretch on the bias, which is essential for the Tidsel design to work. You can use fabrics other than silk, such as viscose or polyester, as long as the fabric has nice drape. We'll also need lining. I'm using a standard plain woven acetate lining. The lining also needs to be cut on the bias, so it's important that it has stretch on the bias too. To stabilize the seam along the center back, I'm using a lightweight woven fusible interfacing, which I've cut into long bias tapes, 2 cm wide. You can also buy ready-made stay tape as long as it's cut on the bias. Whether to use interfacing on the center back seam is entirely optional, and there are pros and cons to doing so, which I'll come back to later. We'll also need sharp microtex needles. If you don't have any, make sure to use a brand new sewing needle instead, so you don't risk damaging the delicate fabric with a blunt one. Finally, we'll need matching thread. In this video I'm sewing the dress with the short flared sleeves, but the process is exactly the same if you chose the long regular sleeves instead. If you'd like to make the sleeveless version, I've put together a separate video guide for that. The first step is to cut out the pattern pieces according to the cutting guide. When cutting on the bias, you should only cut one layer at a time. Lay the fabric out on a large surface. If your table isn't big enough, use the floor. The fabric must be smoothed out with nothing pulling at it. If you have pre-washed it, I also recommend giving it a thorough press to avoid any unwanted creases. Place the pattern piece on the fabric at a 45-degree angle relative to the grain line. You can use the arrows on the pattern pieces to guide you. Take your time doing this to make sure the pattern piece is positioned correctly before you cut. I recommend transferring the pattern notches during the cutting phase by snipping a small 2 to 3 mm nick into the seam allowance. Because the fabric is so fluid, it can be difficult to locate the markings again once the pattern piece has been cut. The front piece should be rotated 45 degrees to one side, while the back pieces are rotated 45 degrees to the other side. It's important to remember to rotate the front and back pieces in opposite directions so the fabric doesn't end up twisting around the body. The lower skirt must be cut twice, once for the front and once for the back. Again, remember to mirror the pattern piece so it faces the right direction relative to the front and back pieces. Have another look at the cutting guide if you are in doubt. The last pieces to be cut are the sleeves. Again, remember to mirror the pattern piece so that each sleeve matches its corresponding armhole in the end. The lining is cut using the same method, but it's important to remember to mirror the lining pieces relative to the outer fabric. But if your lining has an identical right and wrong side, you don't need to bother with this. As I mentioned earlier, there are pros and cons to using interfacing or stay tape on the center back seam. The advantage is that it adds extra reinforcement to a seam that can take a lot of strain when you move around, sit down and so on. If the fabric is particularly delicate, an unstabilized seam can easily be pulled apart. The downside is that the seam can have a tendency to ripple slightly as it becomes stiffer than the surrounding fabric. It's entirely up to you whether you use stay tape or not. In this video, I'll be using it. Bring the two back pieces of outer fabric over to the ironing board. Smooth out the pieces so they are lying correctly before adding the bias cut stay tape along the center back on each back piece. Remember to press the stay tape onto the wrong side of the fabric. It's really important that the fabric is lying correctly when you fuse on the stay tape, otherwise it can cause problems when the pieces are sewn together. As mentioned, I'm sewing the dress with French seams. This isn't a strict requirement though, so you're more than welcome to sew the dress with regular seams if you prefer. Place the two back pieces on top of each other, wrong sides together, and pin along the back seam. It's important not to pull on the fabric whilst pinning, as you risk ending up with a crooked seam. Lay the pieces flat on the table and insert the pins carefully. Remember to match the notches on the seam allowance with each other. I've marked these with pins here so you can see them more clearly. Sew the back seam with a 5mm seam allowance. It can be tricky to get started, so I recommend beginning about 2 cm into the seam and back stitching to the start first. It's much easier to stop the machine from swallowing the fabric that way. It's also important that the fabric glides through the machine as smoothly as possible. Don't pull on the fabric, simply guide it through. As I mentioned, my fabric is incredibly fluid and tricky to work with. Even though I was very careful when cutting, there's still a slight difference between the right and left back pieces around the shoulder and armhole. Annoying as it is, it's also to be expected, so now is a good time to correct it. Bring the pieces to the ironing board and start by trimming the seam allowance down by 1 to 2 mm. Next, press the seam open. This can be a little fiddly since the seam allowance is now quite narrow, so be patient and work in small sections at a time. Finally, press the seam flat with the pieces facing right sides together. Now sew the French seam by stitching 5 mm from the edge, enclosing the previous seam allowance. From the wrong side, press the seam towards the right back piece. Look at this beautiful, neat and hard-wearing finish. Place the lower back skirt against the back pieces, wrong sides together, and pin along the slanted seam. Sew the pieces together in the same way as before, with a 5 mm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance down by about 1 to 2 mm again. Press the seam allowance open first. Then press the seam flat with the pieces facing right sides together. Complete the French seam with a stitch 5 mm from the edge, enclosing the seam allowance. And finish by pressing the seam downwards towards the skirt. Now we need to join the front bodice with the front skirt, again finishing with a French seam. The lining pieces should be sewn together in exactly the same way as the outer fabric, meaning all seams are finished as French seams. There is one important difference, however. The lining pieces must be mirrored relative to the outer fabric. You'll see why in just a moment. Place the joined back pieces, in lining and outer fabric, on top of each other, right sides together. Pin along the neckline seam. The center back seam on the lining should be pressed to the opposite side from the seam on the outer fabric. Sew the pieces together at the neckline with a regular stitch 1 cm from the edge. Press the seam allowance towards the lining. From the right side, understitch the seam allowance down with a stitch a few millimeters from the edge. Now we need to join the front pieces. Lay the front piece and outer fabric flat on the table, right side facing up. Place the lining on top, right sides together, and pin along the curved edge of the facing and lining. Match the center front of the outer fabric with the center front of the lining to keep everything symmetrical. Sew the pieces together with a regular stitch 1 cm from the edge, then press the seam open with the iron. Now we need to join the shoulder seams on the front and back pieces. Lay the joined front piece flat on the table with the outer fabric and lining facing away from each other, both with the right side facing up. Match the shoulder seam from the joined back pieces with the open shoulder seam on the front piece. Make sure to position the neck seam precisely at the center of the open shoulder seam. Pin in place. Sew the pieces together with a regular stitch 1 cm from the edge, then finish by pressing the shoulder seams open. Now we need to finish the side seams, which should again be sewn as French seams. With the lining sitting loosely inside the dress, pin along the side seam of the outer fabric wrong sides together. Remember to match the notches. Sew the side seam with a 5 mm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance by 1 to 2 mm. Press it open. Then press the seam flat again with the right side of the dress facing inward. Finish the side seam with a stitch 5 mm from the edge. Do exactly the same with the lining. Pin the side seams wrong sides together, sew with a 5 mm seam allowance. Trim. Press open. Then press flat again with the lining right sides together. Finish the side seam with a stitch 5 mm from the edge. Now we've reached the sleeves. To prepare the dress, I baste the 2 layers together all the way around the armhole with large loose stitches. In this video I'm showing how to set in the flared sleeve, but the process is exactly the same for the narrow long sleeve. Find the sleeves. Fold each sleeve lengthwise so the 2 side seams lie on top of each other, wrong sides together. Pin and finish the side seams as French seams. Pin the sleeve into the armhole, wrong sides together. Remember to match the shoulder marking with the shoulder seam and distribute the sleeves extra ease evenly around the sleeve head. Stitch the sleeve to the armhole using a 5mm seam allowance. You may want to go to 7mm as you're working with 3 layers that can shift slightly. Trim the seam allowance down to about 3 to 4mm and press it open. This is easiest to do over a tailor's hem working in small sections. Then press the seam flat with the right side of the sleeve facing the right side of the dress. Finish the French seam with a stitch 5mm from the edge, sewing at a steady, unhurried pace so you stay in full control. All that's left now is to hem the dress and finish the sleeve edges. I recommend trying the dress on before finishing the hems. The dress tends to be longer at the front than the back, though this varies depending on each person's shape. If the difference is quite pronounced, it should be corrected. In my case, I actually need to trim the front outer fabric by 2 cm, though it's not necessary for the lining. I press the hemline on the lining 2 cm to the wrong side, then fold it over another 2 cm to the wrong side and press again. Depending on how your lining behaves relative to the outer fabric, you may need to trim the lining shorter before hemming. You could start by trimming it by 2 cm, for example. I recommend that the lining be at least 2.5 cm shorter than the dress once both layers are hemmed. Stitch the lining in place with a stitch approximately 2 cm from the edge. The outer fabric is finished as a narrow rolled hem finished in 2 stages. The first step is to press the bottom edge of the skirt 1 cm to the wrong side all the way around. Do the same with the sleeve hem, pressing it 1 cm to the wrong side. Stitch the hem in place approximately 2 mm from the edge on both the skirt and the sleeves. Trim the hem edge down to 4 to 5 mm all the way around. Press the hem edge approximately 4 mm to the wrong side. This should bring the stitching you've just made to sit in the center of the finished hem. From the right side, stitch the hem in place approximately 2 mm from the edge, essentially sewing over the previous stitching. When doing this, it's important not to pull on the fabric, let the machine do the work and simply guide the fabric through. It helps a lot to increase the stitch length to 3 and to start just before or after one of the side seams to avoid creating a barrier the machine can choke on. Do the same on the sleeves. Well done! The dress is finished and ready to be shown off at summer parties or wherever else the occasion calls for it. Don't forget to follow Beklædt on Instagram at beklædt_sewing. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys!